Hello, I'm Adam Wren,
And I'm Zack Stanton. It's Friday, August 1st.
and this is the Playbook Podcast. For the second time this week, I have the pleasure of welcoming my fellow Midwesterner and Playbook editor, Zack Stanton, to the podcast. Zack, welcome.
Great to be here as always, Adam.
And without further ado, here's what's driving the day. First up, the day has finally come. With the markets closed and the August 1st deadline having passed overnight, President Donald Trump went through his pledge to impose a wave of new tariffs. Except that last night, he announced that in 7 days, he'll raise tariffs on more than 60 nations, including a number of those close U.S. trading partners. Zack, is this just another instance of the taco Trump dynamic? Trump always chickens out?
Yes and no. Yeah, as you mentioned, Taco Trump is this idea popular in certain circles on Wall Street in particular, that when push comes to shove, Trump sees how negatively the markets react to his tariff threats and eventually backs down before they take effect. And that's not quite what's happening here. Markets did go down yesterday, but it wasn't the same sort of huge swinging loss that we saw in spring. Liberation Day Part 3, for lack of a better metaphor, is the quieter sequel to its predecessor in April. And it's an open question just how negatively the markets will react today when they open. We talked with our colleague Daniel DeRochers about this. He reports on international trade here at Politico. And he noted that one of the tricky things here is that Trump's faith in tariffs has now actually been buoyed by the market's performance. As the economy has sort of chugged along, despite the impact of his tariffs, it has given him more confidence that they aren't going to be disruptive or harm the economy. Now, the new rates are going to be a major test of that experiment, especially since the inflationary effects of the tariffs have so far been borne by businesses rather than consumers. And that's probably going to change soon once the inventory those businesses stockpiled earlier this year grows thin. But Adam, that raises some political questions of what we're going to see in the days and weeks ahead, including, of course, how this is going to resonate with voters. You've been talking to Republican candidates in particular about this. What have they been telling you?
Yeah, it's interesting, Zach, talking with Mike Rogers, of course, the Republican Senate candidate in Michigan, which is probably one of the most, if not the most significant battleground where Republicans think they can flip a seat from retiring Senator Gary Peters, a Democrat, to a Republican control. And Michigan is interesting, as you know, in your home state, because it's so manufacturing heavy and it's so exposed to these tariffs. It's also so close geographically to Canada. And what Rogers told me was that essentially he thinks he's in good shape if these deals are done by the end of this year, before the campaign really kicks off in 2026. But he did tell me that he's had calls with the White House when there are cases of tariff carves out that don't make sense, that hurt Michigan businesses. He's actually gotten on the phone with people in the White House and used some interesting language to say, they've not always been, I think he actually used the word, quote, rational, end quote, which I thought was fascinating. And he says the good news, as he sees it, is the White House has been receptive. So a little bit of what I read to be some muted criticism about the entire rollout of these liberation days. We're now on number 3. I thought that was really fascinating. And then in Kentucky, in a 3-way Senate primary on the Republican side to replace Mitch McConnell, Nate Morris is out with a new ad today that Playbook obtained first that goes all in on Trump's tariffs, recorded in a hollowed out factory in Kentucky. Particularly interesting because the bourbon in Kentucky has been yanked off the shelves in a lot of Canadian markets. So super fascinating that we have an example of a Republican using tariffs as a cudgel in a contested Republican primary.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going to be something to watch. And in a way, it kind of brings us to the second thing that I want to talk about, which is the White House at this moment in time. With the tariffs yesterday, it was a much more orderly process and in some ways more well honed than the White House went through earlier this year with the tariff rollouts. But in other ways, here as August begins, this White House has maintained some of the fly by the seat of the pants type quality that has defined its early months. And in that regard, the influence of Laura Loomer, the far right activist, is really emblematic of how power can work both within the MAGA universe and within Trump's Washington. Adam, I know you've been doing some reporting into this, including talking pretty extensively with Laura Loomer and with folks in the White House orbit. How would you describe the role she plays in this administration, even though she technically isn't part of it?
Yeah, she has really become Trump's loyalty enforcer outside the White House. We report with our colleagues, Eli Stokel's, Ben Johansson, and Maya Ward this morning that there have been more than 2 dozen high ranking officials across the administration that have been forced to leave their positions or have their nominations or promotions abandoned due mostly in large part to the work of Laura Loomer. She tells us that the White House has an ongoing rolling, quote, vetting crisis, end quote, which is fascinating because she's a Trump ally. She talks to the president. She was welcomed into the offices of Vice President J.D. Vance not too long ago. And we know that she's in these folks' ear. And much to the chagrin of some people in the West Wing, she has influence and she's getting these people fired and vetting them. What's most fascinating to me, though, is that she says she has a great relationship with Chief of Staff Susie Wiles. So sort of raises questions about what the information flow is like on some of these. She also said there are, quote, hundreds of more people she expects to be purged from the administration, which I find breathtaking. I mean, that's a lot of turnover just 7 months in or so.
Yeah, you mentioned that she's become sort of a MAGA loyalty enforcer, someone who plays sort of an outsized role in policing the administration and whether or not figures in it are sufficiently MAGA or not. What is your sense of what Laura Loomer's game plan is here? And does she relish playing this role, or is there some sort of bigger goal she has in mind for herself?
Well, she has tried, she told me, to get an administration job 4 times. She thinks of herself as a journalist. She told me this week that she thinks she's one of the most influential journalists in the nation, if not the world right now, because she's having an impact on staffing decisions. And we can quibble with her definition of herself as a journalist, as someone who gathers information and uses it in an independent way. Certainly, we wouldn't say that she's independent given her MAGA loyalties. But as an information gatherer, she does have a claim to be someone who's influential given these firings and departures. And what's interesting to me is that she's actually trying to get a press credential. She wants to get a press credential to cover the White House and hasn't been able to get it. So I think there's a case where she wants to continue to be aligned with Donald Trump, but that means that often her interests are at odds with people in the White House. And what's really fascinating is she tells me that it's not just her going and digging all of this information up about Trump appointees, people in the Trump White House. She's actually telling me now that people in the West Wing, people in the White House are coming to her and using her as a conduit to get their own enemies expunged in the White House, which really kind of calls back, I think, a lot to Trump 1.0, some of the infighting and den of vipers feel that came out in a lot of the reporting back then.
She has a tip line of some sort, or how does that
Yeah,
work?
she has a tip line. She has a tip line. She has lots of relationships with people in the White House. And so she gets tips, she tells me, from Trump loyalists in the White House who don't like a particular person. They shop Oppo to her.
Hmm,
She checks it out, and her results are pretty telling, I think.
that's fascinating.
And the third big story in Washington today involves 2026, especially as the redistricting arm race continues to heat up. Yesterday, we saw Governor Gavin Newsome suggest that he might put a ballot measure before California voters this year that would allow the state's Democratic run government to redraw the maps into a huge gerrymander in response to Texas's proposed mid cycle Republican gerrymander. I'm curious, Zach, as these redistricting wars play out, what do you think is going to be the net benefit to either party? It seems to me, in the grand analysis, that at best we're battling to some kind of draw here that could actually, in places like Texas, even endanger Republican incumbents.
Many of the districts that were drawn in the Texas map basically take as a baseline the Trump 2024 numbers as if they're just applicable to Republicans more broadly. But we don't know that. That's a pretty big assumption. We don't know whether or not these voters are mainly Trump or whether they are actually all in for Republicans other than Donald Trump. And that's going to be a big question mark as we head into 2026. But more broadly across the United States, this is just an arms race that it's hard to see where the spiral stops. You have more states that are going to be able to do this in favor of Republicans than are going to be able to do this in favor of Democrats. And partly that's because Democrats have sort of unilaterally disarmed in some of the blue states by passing nonpartisan redistricting commissions. And that's true even in California, which is why Newsom is talking about taking this to voters and putting this before them. And he has said that he doesn't want to disempower the nonpartisan redistricting process, that he wants to basically just make sure that we're dealing with the partisan gerrymander that we see in Texas as though it's some sort of one-time thing. But if it's one time that you open this can of worms, the can of worms is open, you can't really unopen it. And it's difficult to see where this stops. You have Florida talking about doing it. Ohio, to some degree, is talking about doing it. Missouri talking about doing it. And the stakes here seem, for Donald Trump, sort of existential in terms of how he wants to play his last few years in office and what he wants them to be like. And he doesn't want the sort of oversight and investigations that would come from a Democratic-controlled House. So it's not a far leap to imagine that he will really pressure Republicans in red states to get in line and redraw their maps.
Yeah, and on the flip side of that, as much as is at stake for Donald Trump, there is a lot of stake for some of the Democrats trying to attach themselves to the counter response. You have Gavin Newsom, who's looking at a 2028 bid. His involvement here, I think, you could argue, makes him kind of a national figure or a foil to Donald Trump. And so there's some political benefit to be had there. You look at Greg Abbott in Texas. He's been talked about as someone who could potentially run in 2028 as well. And I think this gives him cachet with certain national Republicans. And then you look at someone like James Tallarico, the state representative who has proposed an independent redistricting commission. This is happening exactly at the right time for him because it allows him to do more interviews, to become a talking head on the issue as he's weighing a Senate run himself, potentially challenging Colin Allred to be the Senate Democratic Texas nominee. So I just think not only the grand calculation is interesting, but some of the positioning individually and some of the 2028, 2026 intrigue for the individual characters here is fascinating to watch as well.
That's for sure.
As always, we try to end the show with something from the Playbook Newsletter. The presidential fitness test will return to American public schools. Zach, do you remember these? Have you done one of these?
I do. It's been about 30 years since I've done one, but I do remember them being the bane of gym class, which was otherwise populated by things like square dancing, which is maybe even less useful than being able to run a 6-minute mile, which actually has some practical applicability.
Yeah. See, for me, gym class memories were dominated not only by this, but whenever the big parachute came out and it was Big Parachute Day.
I love that. Yeah.
But we're dating ourselves here. President Trump made the announcement yesterday, accompanied by, among others, Kansas City Chiefs kicker Harrison Butker, Bryson DeChambeau, and pro wrestling's Triple H. HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will lead the revival of the fitness challenge, which was discontinued in 2012. As always, send us your tips, birthdays, or spotted moments to Playbook at Politico.com. Zach, thanks so much. This was super fun.
My pleasure.
And that's all for today's Playbook podcast. We have much more news and analysis in today's Playbook newsletter, which you can find at Politico.com/Playbook. We'll be back on Monday. Have a great weekend.